Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Ask the Expert. My name is Madeline Countess, and I'll be your moderator for today's panel. By way of introduction, I'm a director in our consulting services organization. I've been with Collaborative for a little more than 8 years, primarily focusing in the HCM implementation space. Prior to joining Collaborative, I spent the better part of a decade working as an HR practitioner in the financial services industry. During my tenure as an HR practitioner, I had the unfortunate experience of becoming overly familiar with today's topic of severance. So while we appreciate that this is not the most glamorous and energy-giving topic, we certainly recognize the currency of this topic given today's economic and business climate. So our agenda today is really going to be gathering together our best experts to help our customers understand best practices and tips for utilizing severance should your business needs require you to use this functionality. Our agenda is the standard. I'll be introducing our panel of experts, saying a little bit about Collaborative, and then we'll jump into the prepared material. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat and we'll be happy to answer them after that prepared material has been delivered. So first up on our panel of experts, we have Jackie Smith.
Hi everyone, I'm Jackie Smith. I am a senior consultant in our HCM practice at Collaborative Solutions. I have been with Collaborative for 5 years and I've been in the ecosystem for about 9 years now. I specialize in compensation and talent, and I am one of the Workday compensation product leads, so I get to see all the stuff coming down the roadmap. And I'm excited to talk with you all today.
Thanks, Jackie. Next, we have Angie Honeycutt from our post-production support services group.
Hi, everyone. As she mentioned, I'm Angie Honeycutt. I have been working here at Collaborative as a principal consultant for the last 1.5 years, almost soon to be 2 years. Prior to that, I worked on the client side where I was a compensation manager. And as Madeline I was in a position where I ended up using the exact functionality that we're going to talk about today. And for the other half of the last 4 years that I've been working in the ecosystem, almost two of those years were here supporting HCM, core compensation, and advanced compensation. So looking forward to giving you as much information as we can today about severance.
Great. Thanks, Angie. Now let's introduce Michelle Turner from our payroll team.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Turner. I have been with Collaborative Solutions now for a little over 2 years. I'm a principal consultant, and I've been working with the Workday system for about 8 years and about 14 years in payroll. So I was on the client side for 6 years and then moved over, and I'm really excited to share what we have with severance today. Thank you.
Thanks, Angie. And last but not least, from Organizational Change and Training, Alexa Abdullah.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Alexa Abdallah here. I'm a manager in our OC&T practice, and I've been with Collaborative for almost 5 years now. I started off on the functional side and actually implemented severance for a couple of our customers, but happy to talk you through any communications and training needs that you guys might have today. Thanks.
Thanks, Alexa. Right. So now, just a little bit about Collaborative. I think most of our participants today are current Collaborative customers, so I won't spend a lot of time on this slide since I think you already know us. As you of course know, we are an HR, financials, and student transformation organization, and we provide a full range of services, including implementation, post-production support, strategy, transformation, and OC&T. What you may not know and what is new is that over the last year or so, we've expanded our offerings to include a couple of strategic partnerships that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen. And really, this is our response to the growing and changing needs of our customers as we continue to evolve with you. Another new item are some new Best Workplaces awards that we've recently won. And if you've been with us long, you know that we are firm believers in the idea that happy consultants make happy customers. And we are very proud of the culture we've built and the awards that we've won for that culture. So without further ado, we'll jump into our best practices for severance. So when we think about severance in Workday, the first thing that we really need to talk about is what really does that mean? What does Workday offer? High level, what is really included in that particular area of Workday? So Angie, if you can jump in and share your thoughts on that, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
All righty. So the severance functionality in Workday basically includes a severance package, a matrix, and a worksheet. The severance package basically defines the types of severance pay components that an employee can receive, basically things like lump sum payments or like ongoing severance payments. The matrix, this is basically where you define the compensation basis that you want Workday to use in the calculation for the severance, and it also defines the duration of the severance payments that a worker's eligible for by eligibility rules. And then the worksheet itself is actually what will get generated, and that's where the calculation will be displayed. It'll show you the duration. So they are entitled to 8 weeks based on the matrix eligibility rules and the dollar amount that that severance was calculated for. And then basically once that worksheet is completed and all the approvals and everything is done, that's when a transaction gets created for a one-time payment that Workday's payroll can pick up, or if you don't use Workday's payroll, you can then pull that information out using a report to pass it on to like ADP or something like that. So those are the key functionality items that come into play with severance.
Okay, thanks, Angie. That's super helpful. As we think about the components, Jackie, can you share a little bit of your experience on what are the most important components for our customers as they think through configuring and utilizing severance?
Sure. Yeah, so like Angie already mentioned, so the most important components that go into using the severance functionality are the severance package. So thinking about the compensation components, the items that you want part of the severance that's being offered. So is it continuation of pay and a bonus payout? Is it a severance lump sum payment? So those are the types of things you need to consider when you're creating your severance package. And then the severance matrix is also a key component. It's a required element as part of the severance functionality. Like Angie mentioned, the severance matrix is what's driving the parameters for the severance package. So who's eligible, and it's going to in turn calculate the severance payout for that worker. And then in addition, you have the compensation elements and the payroll earnings code. So those are obviously very important. You want to make sure the compensation elements are linked to the correct payroll earnings codes, and those are set up correctly to calculate the severance in payroll.
Okay, thanks. That's super helpful. I heard you mention a little bit about lump sum and ongoing payments. So can you tell us a little bit about the difference and how those things would flow through to payroll? What would that look like from an employee standpoint?
Yeah,
and
sure.
I think
I can take. Yeah, I was going to say I'll give it. I can pass it to Angie. Angie, if you want to take that one.
Perfect. Okay. Okay.
Sure.
Angie, if you want to jump in, that.
No problem. So think of lump sum as it's a one-time. Some companies choose to pay out at the end of termination. They pay $1 amount at that time. severance is over with. So that's what a lump sum would be. And an ongoing severance is when you want to pay someone for, let's say they are eligible for 24 weeks of severance based on the eligibility rules, then the ongoing would basically pay them just like a normal pay cycle would pay them if they were employed up to that 24-week period or whatever the number of weeks that they were eligible for.
Okay, so that ongoing payment is really replacing the income stream. It looks similar to the income stream from the employee standpoint, but they are actually terminated in Workday, correct?
That is correct.
Great, thanks, Angie. That's super helpful. Now, as we think about the workflow that would be involved in a process like this, I'd like to ask Jackie to walk us through what the basic steps are and how do we normally see that configured? I'm sure there's lots of options, but what do we see most commonly used and what works best for our customers?
Yep. Yeah. So the two key basic steps in the business process flow for severance are creating the severance worksheet and delivering the severance worksheet. And typically what we see is the HR partner creating the severance worksheet. So they're initiating the process, they're they're selecting the worker that's getting the severance, checking that the payout calculation looks correct, all the components are there correctly. And then typically we do see a review and approval step by compensation to make sure that everything is accurate. And then the HR partner with the final step to deliver the severance worksheet. And part of this step entails communication with the employee outside of Workday. So it might be the HR partner putting together the severance documentation and then delivering that to the worker, and then coming back to this deliver severance worksheet step and really documenting the dates of communication, the sign-off date from the worker, any additional dates that need to be documented. And then once they click submit, essentially the worksheet will be completed, that business process.
Thanks, Jackie. That's super helpful. I think we are turning to Angie next to talk about when these tasks are normally performed.
So that particular question is pretty open-ended because it truly depends on the company's business practices and the process. But typically what we see is there's usually decisions made that a number of people are going to be severanced. At that point, typically you will find that the worksheet gets created as my mind just went blank. On what I was going to say, as Jackie was saying, as far as the business process goes. So typically it is make the decision on who's going to be severanced. If those people are already employed and not terminated already, which is typical, but not out of the norm with Workday's 32's changes, you can now create a severance worksheet if the employee is termed or not. But typically we see that's decided before they are termed. So that worksheet gets created, it gets routed as Jackie was mentioning. And then once the approvals, then you start putting together legal documentation, what that actual severance agreement is going to look like. You will already have the calculations of what the severance payout's going to be, what the remaining vacation pay that they earned but had not used is, any information about benefits, about COBRA, about outplacement services. All of those are usually determined at that time. Then the termination will take place, and then that severance agreement with all of that information will be presented to the worker. And then you kind of sit, because a worker has a certain amount of time, depending on their age, on when they have to sign the agreement. So it kind of sits in lull until that agreement is signed. Once it is signed, then that business process Jackie was mentioning will come to a closure, and then the payroll will start picking everything up and start paying. So that's kind of what I see in the environment that I've worked in here at Collaborative, as well as what we did when I was on the client side.
Thanks, Angie. And I think you kind of mentioned this and started to, tee this next topic up. But I know in the past, many of my customers have looked at Workday's severance functionality and they've decided that it really wasn't flexible enough for their use. But I think I heard that there were some recent updates and that the functionality has been augmented by some, new features that make it more applicable to more customers. Can you share a little bit about how this has evolved over the last couple of releases?
Actually, I think Jackie would be a better person for that. So Jackie, I'm gonna push that question over to you if you don't mind.
Thanks, Angie. And welcome, Jackie.
I will take this one because I was super excited about one of the biggest enhancements with Severance recently is the ability to create and deliver severance worksheets when a termination is in progress or completed. So believe it or not, previously you had to complete the severance worksheet process before terminating the worker. And that was a huge gap for a lot of customers and a big pain point because they want, customers want to, you guys want to get in there and term the employee right away, not keep them active. So this was a big win, being able to get the termination process and then do the severance worksheet. And then in addition to that, you now have the ability to give a worker more than one severance worksheet. I think this is especially helpful for rehires. Before, there was a big gap or error when you tried to give, employee that received severance before was rehired and unfortunately is getting it again. You couldn't do that. And now you have the option to round the length of service result. So, if I resulted in 3.75 years of eligibility for severance before, it would be just that. It would be calculated off of that. And now you can round that to your choosing. So if you round up, I could be, eligible for 4 years, for example. So those are probably the three biggest enhancements, I would say, over the past couple releases. There is some UI configuration changes, but these would probably be the biggest impacts.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. That's super helpful. And I can see how those additions might make this functionality much more applicable to a broader group of customers. So we've talked quite a bit about what we have to do on the HCM and comp side and how we might get that set up. But obviously, it's critical to have this flow over to payroll correctly because that is actually the goal. We are trying to pay people the severance pay, whether it be lump sum or ongoing pay. So now I'd like to turn to our payroll expert, Michelle Turner, to talk a little bit about how this looks in payroll and what considerations we might want to think about as we're getting to the point where we're ready, people have signed their agreement and we're ready to pay them out.
Hey guys, so as Jackie mentioned, there is one thing that there's a piece of the payroll initial process you have to have done before you can actually see what it looks like in payroll. So you have to get your pay components set up. You have to get the run category set up for non-active, which includes your pay components, which, in case you might not know the terminology of everything, a pay component is your earnings code that you're going to get set up. And on that part, there is a piece in there that will tie to the compensation element, and that's what pulls this in. So before you can ever see it actually flow into the payroll calculation, you have to make sure that key piece is done. And from feedback that I've been talking to some of the my coworkers is a lot of the clients will leave certain pieces of that off and they're like, oh, it's not pulling in. So key part, main thing you need to always have set up. Once that's done, payroll doesn't have a lot other to do except run the pay calc and it will just flow in. If it's a lump sum payment, it will roll in depending on when the severance document is signed by the employee. If the current payroll is still open and it's a term period, it will pull right into that payroll. If it is after they've already termed and that pay period is complete, it will pull into the next one. There's a catch to that if you have retro. If you do not use retro, you will have to do another step, which is the HR person will have to go in and actually change the date of the payment to make sure it pulls into the next open payroll. But if you have retro and you run it normally, it will pull in the lump sum payment. You will have no issues. And then the ongoing payment will start after they term on the next open pay period. So payroll doesn't have to go in and do any extra manual work or anything. It just flows in wonderfully. And some of the things I wanted to bring up is testing. When that is kind of like, as on the slide says, one of the best practices and watchouts is testing. Always make sure that you test from beginning to end to make sure you don't leave any of these key elements out, and that will help the process run really smooth. Let's see, anything else? I think that's all right now, in case we have some questions.
I think you covered it. Thank you very much, Michelle. Now let's turn back to Angie to talk a little more about testing. And of course, Jackie, you are always welcome to chime in if you want to share any additional thoughts. So take it away, Angie.
All right. So testing is pretty simple, I think, with the severance process, because most of the time you already know kind of what the calculation should look like. In most cases, there's a budget that you're considering, you're already kind of thinking in advance. But some of the key things that you have to test is definitely the matrix eligibility rules, because that is truly what's dictating who is eligible and if the calculation is going to produce the right number of weeks for the workers for their agreement. So the compensation rounding rules that Jackie mentioned is something new, and that will control, if you think about it, her point of 3.75 years, if you don't have the rounding rules set correctly, then you could underpay someone because it only calculates that they get a number of weeks for 3 years, versus it could give them too much and give them counted as 4 years. So the matrix eligibility rules is key. The compensation rules is key. And then the business process flow as well. You want to make sure that it is routing correctly. Depending on your routing rules, I have seen clients who have routing rules. If you are in X country, then it goes to this group of HR people. If you're in a different country, it goes to a different group. And so you want to make sure that your business process is routing to the correct location. And then after it is completed, it's going to calculate, it's going to add the one-time payment to the worker. So of course you want to validate that that took place, and the checkbox to send to payroll is definitely checked, which is a default, but someone can actually uncheck that. So you want to validate that. And probably I would think the most critical one is Michelle's part, talking about the pay components. You must run a payroll calc to make sure that it is actually picking up that the pay components or earnings codes and everything was configured correctly, and that that payroll cycle is picking that up. So definitely each part of the process really needs to be tested thoroughly to make sure the end result comes out to be the final dollar amount that you need.
Thanks, Angie. I think that's very helpful. It sounds like, you know, we have to test each component separately, but then we also need to make sure that we test that entire flow end to end to ensure that everything's working properly. I think Michelle had a little bit that she wanted to add from a payroll perspective. Michelle?
Yes, I just wanted to also bring up, there are some reports out there that you can pull in severance, but depending on your security level in payroll, you might not have access to those reports. So you can ask your team, the HR team, if they can add it into the severance BP to have a notification sent to payroll if you wanted to have that, because auditing is also another big thing. You always want to make sure everything is flowing through correctly and you do your correct audits, just like you do with any other calculations that you know are coming through. So I just wanted to bring that up also to see if you wanted your payroll team to get a notification, you could try to work that into that business process also.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out, Michelle. I mean, this is something where, you know, we are dealing with an employee population who are, you know, a little bit more sensitive, and, you know, we certainly want to make sure that, you know, we handle their payments with as much care as possible. So adding in that extra step, you know, as a double check for payroll is probably a really great idea. So before we turn to our questions from the participants here, one last thought. I'd like to ask Alexa to share a little bit about her thoughts on training and how we might roll this out. If we're dealing with a large population, we might have quite a few HR business partners who are involved in a process like this. So,
absolutely. Thanks, Madeline. So I've seen this rolled out a couple different ways, and I really think it depends on how you will be utilizing this process. So for example, is it more for one-off severances, or does your company do big reductions in force once a year? So kind of taking that into consideration, as well as what kind of training works well for your organization. Are you fundamentally opposed to job aids because they don't get used, which is, can be pretty typical. Before COVID, were you more instructor-led training, in-person training? Can you get people away for an hour to do a webinar? So we do like to take all those things into consideration when making a recommendation. But what I've seen work really well is for those customers who only will utilize this process, once or twice a year for those big reduction in force severances, to do a job aid. That way they have something that they can refer back to. But I also like to see a 30 to 60 minute webinar so that they can walk through the functionality, also talk about some of the outside of the system processes that still need to occur. Because as we know, Workday doesn't take the place of those conversations. So those are two things I've seen work really well. Additionally, that's more specifically for HR. I've also seen, as my colleagues have talked about, there are some items that payroll will need to process as well. And so not necessarily a full job aid, but maybe just a list of tasks that they need to perform or keep in mind as they're going through, whether it be a one-off severance or a mass severance. From a communications perspective, obviously this is held pretty close to the cuff. Usually I've seen very targeted communications to HR and payroll specifically. You may let the C-suite know as well, just, hey, we're implementing this functionality just so that you're aware, nothing you need to do. This will all be handled by HR, but just so that they're in the know. So those are the predominant things. Oh, I'm sorry. Those are the predominant things that we take into consideration for severance training and communications. But I know we have a question and answer time, so please let me know if there's anything that you guys have specific questions on for your organization.
All right, thanks, Alexa. We do have some questions from our attendees, and we'll just run through them. Our first question is really about the workflow and wanting more understanding about specifically which BP is going to drive that severance process. And is that an end-to-end process for capturing the signatures? So does that process actually involve the employee, similar to submit resignation, or is that process really more of an HR-facing process? And kind of what considerations about it moving to the next step in terms of whether we are paying out a lump sum or ongoing? So I think let's start with Jackie on that, and we may also hear from Angie, depending on what Jackie shares with us.
Sure. So it is not an employee-facing business process. To answer that question, it is really strictly an HR process to produce the severance amount that needs to be paid and get it approved. And they are documenting the dates that the employee is signing the severance agreement outside of Workday. So while that will be documented within that business process, the employee is not receiving the information within that business process. The BP in Workday is called Create Severance Worksheet, just to formally put the name out there of what it's called. But yeah, the employee is not part of that business process.
Okay. And I think, Jackie, our next question, we probably already know the answer to based on your answer to the last question. But our next question is, does Workday have the ability to generate the legal document or the severance agreement that the employee signs So I'm sure, the customer who's asking this has seen all of the enhancements in the employee agreement functionality, where we now generate employee agreements in recruiting. We are able to generate faculty agreements when we add appointments to faculties. Do we have that document generation capability within the severance process, or is that something still that has to happen outside of Workday?
So I actually have implemented that for a customer. We use the generate document functionality that exists in Workday. So you're able to, create documents. And, I don't know if everyone has seen it. You might not get the full look and feel that you have, at your paper copy outside of Workday, but it can generate, a document kind of the same way offer letters are. So you can have variable text blocks, like if you need something for 40 and over that you don't need for, under that age group. So I did do something like that for a customer, and it worked out for them. It definitely isn't. I'm not going to say there's a lot of formatting options, but it got the job done.
Okay. And would that be then something that you would print and then hand to the employee?
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Great. So there's not an e-sign capability, but actually there is the ability to generate that document. That's fantastic. I wish I'd had that when I was an HR practitioner. All right. Our next question is about the severance period, and can that severance period be adjusted? So I think really, if I'm reading this question correctly, it's about flexibility of the severance worksheet. Once we've configured that matrix, are we locked into that rules? What happens if for some reason we want to give somebody something extra? Do we have that flexibility or capability? And maybe I'll turn to Angie and see, Angie, if that's a question that you feel comfortable answering.
Yes, and the answer is yes, Madeline, you can. Let's talk about if it's lump sum versus ongoing. So with lump sum, it's generating $1 amount. You can add to that dollar amount. In my experience, on the client side, we had people who were on bonus plans, and as a part of their severance, if they worked depending on our bonus policy, they were still entitled to a bonus payment. So we actually modified that lump sum payment to include the bonus amount that they needed to be awarded. So that's one example. If it's an ongoing severance, and let's say the rule said that they got 6 weeks, but you wanted to give them 8 weeks, you can change the duration to 8, and it'll automatically recalc for you the additional 2 weeks in dollar amounts there. So you do have flexibility with lump sum or ongoing severance to change that amount.
All right, thanks, Angie. That's very helpful. We do have one final question in the chat, and it's really about the EIB for the request post-termination process. So maybe, Jackie, if you can share a little bit about how that EIB would work. Can you change compensation? Could I change someone's base pay after they're termed, and how would that interact with this business process?
Yeah, so the request post-termination compensation BP is unrelated to the severance worksheet business process. Just to be clear there, they're not connected to each other. So that business process is really just changing a terminated worker's compensation. You can change salary and allowance plan information as part of that business process, and that's it, nothing else. But so some customers do use that business process for for their terminated workers instead of the severance functionality, and so they may add a severance salary plan, for instance, on there, and then change the pay. But you can't add like a severance lump sum payment using that business process. So it is strictly to change somebody's salary.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. I think, and I see we actually have a few more questions coming in. And I think the next question, Jackie, is something that you touched on in some of your earlier comments. And the question is, can you use the severance calc for modeling? So in other words, can you create one calc and then, based on that calc, maybe delete that and create a second calc before deciding on the final one. So if we think about, and I can certainly imagine a use case where we are maybe looking at someone at a higher level in the organization and we want to be careful, and we might be looking at several options for them where we would want to compare different options, perhaps a lump sum compared to ongoing pay, and really make an informed decision about what we wanted to offer that person. So I think I'm going to come back to you, Jackie, to see if that's a question that you feel comfortable answering based on your knowledge of the current functionality.
Yeah, so I don't know. So modeling, I'm not sure if it really would be capable, right? Because you have to be eligible for when you're creating the severance worksheet, you have to be eligible for one and only one of those parameters for it to really work and calculate. So you can always change the severance amount that was calculated. So you're not stuck with the calculated amount, but there isn't really a way to kind of change where the worker is falling in the parameters.
Okay. Yeah, so this sounds like a case for sandbox to me.
Madeline.
Yeah.
So I can add to that a situation that I had with a customer. I won't call it quote unquote modeling, but it did meet that need. And what they did is they created basically two packages and two different matrix. In matrix 1, the rules gave them 2 weeks for every year, and the other matrix, it gave them 3 weeks. And so they would create the worksheet, picking the package for package number 1 for that worker, see what it calculated, cancel that, run it again, pick package 2, which had a completely different matrix and had different rules, to see what that value is. So it's not a great modeling tool, but it is doable. It just requires you having to start one, cancel it, start another one, cancel it.
Okay, thanks, Angie. That is very helpful. So our next question is about a little bit about the process, and I think it's really going to end up falling in Michelle's court from a payroll standpoint. So once the employee signs and returns the worksheet, do all the payments go to retro or to that term date, or do they start paying? But like, does it start paying when the agreement is returned, or go to retro and true ups? Can you talk a little bit about that? And I think Michelle, maybe separate that out into whether we have a lump sum or ongoing pay, because I imagine those two things would work differently in this situation.
Well, lump sum is just going to be one payment. So when you run your retro, and if it goes back, it's just going to pay that on that next paycheck that's available. So it's not going to like double up or anything. As far as the ongoing severance, it goes back, and your severance worksheet uses the date after termination date to start those. That's the date that it uses when it goes back to retro. It goes back to, if they term on the 11th and the 12th is when your ongoing starts, that's what it's going to go back to do, start on the weeks. There is an actual community post out there right now on Workday community that workers want an option, or clients want an option to be able to change that, because same thing that the question was, they don't want it to start until after the document's signed. And that's what the date they want to use for the retro. But right now, that's not the way it's set up from what I'm understanding from the community post that's out there. It's something that they're trying to work on to see if there's a way to change that. And I can provide the post out there for you guys when this is over, so you can go look at it and you can make and vote on it, brainstorms and everything that's out there, because I believe that that's what they're trying to push towards. But you can also, you have that option if you don't want something to retro, back for a further date, you can change that workers no retro processing prior to date. If you change that to be the day that they signed it, it's not going to go back further. But again, you want to test that and make sure it's going to bring in the results that you want, because you're still going to have to add out, I think, put your pay through date out. So that's just, you got to, work through that part of it. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Yeah, I did. And that's super helpful. And I think, great idea. When we do post the written answers from this, we will include the links to those brainstorms in that document so that those of you who have signed up and listened can vote for those brainstorms and upvote some of that functionality. So Michelle, I think the next question is actually really for you. So really just tips, any tips for those customers using Severance with a third-party payroll system? And since I know you're Workday payroll, you may not actually be the right person for this, so I will leave it to the team. This might end up being an Angie question.
Yeah, I think this is more an Angie question. I know the process with Workday, but as far as third party, you just wouldn't send it to payroll because there's not a payroll system to attach it to. They probably have to take the worksheet and deliver it to the third party, but I'll let you take that, Angie.
No
Thanks,
problem. So it actually depends on how your current setup is with that third party. If you have an integration that's built in Workday that feeds over like to ADP, then you could build an integration to pull that one-time payment for that worker. Let's say I have clients who actually produce an Excel document that they actually send not via an integration at all. And if that is the case, then there are reports that you can build to pull out that calculated one-time payment that is already set up for you. If it is a lump sum, that's easy, one time. But if it is an ongoing one, then that's an internal process that you're going to have to do on every week until that person is paid, which can be a little more challenging, but can be doable. It just requires you to monitor it in a different way to make sure that each week you're sending it over for X employee until his weeks are finished. So it really truly depends on if you have integration set up or you don't have integration.
Okay, thanks, Angie. So we are nearly at time, and we actually do have quite a few additional questions in the chat. We're going to answer one more, and then I think what we'll do is we will follow up, and in our Q&A document that we publish afterwards, we'll make sure we hit any questions that haven't been answered. And since there's been a lot of questions, I do want to mention that obviously, if you are, a current customer engaged with us, you are welcome to socialize the questions that you have with your contact on our side, either in the implementation side or on the CBS side. Because we know this is definitely a topic that's of interest to many of our customers. The last question that I want to tackle is, can you use electronic signature? I see that in here actually twice. Do we have the opportunity for the employee to e-sign? And I believe, Jackie, you said that this is not an employee-facing business process, so we don't actually have that opportunity. We would have to print the agreement out and to have the employee give us a wet signature for that. Can you confirm that for me, Jackie?
Yeah, that's correct, Madeline. Unfortunately, right now, the employee as self cannot be part of the severance process. So there is no way to, send that document to them. A great idea for a brainstorm for sure. And I'll have to check and see if there isn't one. If there's one out there, I'll definitely include that in the, the documentation that we put together afterwards.
All right. Thanks, Jackie. And thanks, everyone, for joining. This has been a great discussion. If your question did not get answered, as I said, we will answer it in the FAQ. And I want to encourage you to sign up for our next Ask the Expert, which is coming up 2 weeks from today. And our topic will be interactions between leave and payroll and how we can ensure, again, that employees are being paid properly. So look forward to lots of good conversation and discussion there. And thank you very much for joining us today. We definitely look forward to hearing from you further, and we'll be responding to your questions shortly. Thanks all.